The royal kitchen of Mbale Kingdom was a world of its own. It breathed with heat, sweat, and voices shouting orders over the clatter of pots and knives. From sunrise to deep into the night, fires roared, cauldrons bubbled, and trays heavy with spiced meats and sugared fruits passed from sweating hands to golden platters bound for the high tables. At the center of this chaos, unseen by most and noticed by none, was a girl named Zivai. She had no last name, no title, no parents to claim her. Years ago, she had simply appeared in the service of the kitchen mistress after a village raid gone wrong. Some said her parents were sorcerers who had vanished into smoke. Others claimed they had been executed for stealing royal food. No one asked, and Zivai never spoke of it. The only truth that remained was that she now belonged to the scullery, and to the women who ruled it with iron ladles. The kitchen mistress, Madame Tandeka, ran the palace's culinary empire with cold fury. Her two daughters, Mfatso and Laleti, shared her cruelty like a family heirloom, always finding new ways to humiliate Zivai. She was not considered a maid or even a servant. She was something less, a ghost in rags, a shadow smudged by soot, her face always half hidden by the ash that clung to her from sleeping near the fireplace. She was made to rise before anyone else and sleep long after the fires dimmed. She scrubbed every pot until her fingers cracked, swept the soot with a broken broom, and fetched water from the freezing well while the others slept. But worst of all, when the nobles had eaten their lavish meals, thick with wild game, golden yams and pounded roots, it was Zivai who was forced to clean the plates in the most humiliating way. Lick them. Not wash. Not scrape. Not wipe. Lick. With her tongue. It was Tandeka's decree, a punishment disguised as tradition. She would line up the empty plates after feasts, greasy and stained with sauces, and make Zivai kneel before them like a dog. Mfatso and Laleti would stand nearby, laughing as they watched her drag her tongue across each porcelain surface, muttering things like, "She should be honored. Her tongue gets more royal flavor than her mouth ever will." Zivai never protested. Not once. She would kneel, eyes lowered, and do as she was told. Her silence frustrated them more than her rebellion ever could have. But within that silence, Zivai kept something alive, something that no humiliation could extinguish. Memories. Flashes of a different life. She remembered her mother's hands, warm, brown, always dusted with flour. She remembered a voice humming lullabies while stirring broth. She remembered laughter once on a rainy night. Her father lifting her into the air, spinning her around until her braids danced like wind chimes. These memories had no home anymore. They were pieces of a vanished world, tucked away in the corners of her mind like pressed flowers in a forgotten book. But they were hers. And when the palace mocked her, when nobles stepped over her like mud, when the heat of the oven stung her arms and the plates stank of half-chewed meat, she clung to those memories like roots beneath scorched earth. There were moments when she thought about running, slipping into the forests at night and never looking back. But where would she go? Who would protect a girl covered in ash with no name and no kin? So she remained. Over time, her silence became something else. Not fear, not numbness, but a kind of listening. She listened to how the vegetables hissed when dropped into oil. She listened to the sounds the spices made when crushed by mortar and pestle. She noticed which meats made the nobles groan in satisfaction and which breads made them smile without knowing why. While no one taught her, she learned more than any cook in the palace. But no one noticed, because they never looked. In the grand feasts of Mbale, she was never spoken to, never thanked, never included, only stepped over, only barked at, only reminded of her place with every cracked dish and every insult tossed like scraps. The nobles never saw her. They saw only the finished platters and full goblets, never the fingers that had once bled onto the trays before being wiped clean. Zivai endured it all with quiet grace, though there were nights when she wept into the ashes of the fireplace where she slept. Not because she was weak but because she still dared to hope. Not for a crown or a gown, but for someone to see her, just once, without disgust. One morning, as she knelt to lick the final plate of a late feast, she caught her reflection in its curved surface, not quite clear but enough. Her face was thin, her eyes wide, her skin streaked with grease and ash. But behind that she saw something else, something waiting. A light, like a spark not yet allowed to burn. She licked the last plate clean, set it down carefully, and rose without a sound. No one cheered her. No one thanked her. But somewhere, deep in the palace stones or perhaps in the folds of her soul, something had begun to shift. It began with silence but soon turned to spectacle. Madame Tandeka had always held the reins of the royal kitchen with a jealous grip, but ever since the nobles began whispering about the strange glow in Zivai's skin, The way her eyes caught firelight like polished riverstones, her hatred deepened. At first she thought it was nonsense. The girl was always covered in soot, hair in tangles, hands like cracked clay. But the glow persisted. Even in rags, Zivai walked with a quiet steadiness that unsettled Tandeka. No matter how cruel the punishment, how vile the task, Zivai never snapped, never screamed. She bowed. She obeyed. Yet something in her spirit never bent. This angered Tandeka more than anything. The woman began inventing new ways to humiliate her. During palace feasts, when the long tables were filled with roasted meats, golden grains, and wine as red as sunset, she would call Zivai forward like a dog. The nobles, drunk and indulgent, welcomed the game. "Bring out the ash girl," they would say, laughter in their throats, fingers tapping goblets. And Tandeka would oblige. Zivai would be summoned to crawl on her knees through the tiled floor of the great hall, a damp cloth tied around her neck like a mock apron. She would be commanded to lick up spills of stew and wine while the nobles watched, laughing and clapping like children at a puppet show. Sometimes they threw down bits of bone and dared her to suck them clean. "Look at her," cried a merchant lord one night, tears in his eyes from laughter. "She's cleaner than a hound and quieter than a rat. We should make her the palace mop." Zivai did as she was told. Always, she crawled. She licked. She scrubbed. Her palms grew raw. Her knees darkened with bruises. Her pride, what little was left, buried itself beneath layers of patience. But Tandeka was not satisfied. Her daughters joined in, pretending to trip over Zivai, dropping food in her hair, laughing at her bent spine. What they never noticed, what none of them ever asked, was why the fires in the kitchen always burned hotter when Zivai was near. Or why the food left on her licking plates never spoiled, even when left out overnight. Or why, when she passed the spice shelf, certain jars vibrated softly in their place. Zivai knew. She remembered fragments. Bits of song. Her mother's voice murmuring legends over a boiling pot. Stories of a people who danced under moonlight until it melted. A tribe who could hum the roots of trees into blossoming. A people called the moon swallowers, who once walked beside spirits and whose blood carried a voice the world could not silence. Zivai didn't understand it fully, but she felt it. In her bones. In the way the floor responded to her touch. In the way herbs bloomed faster where she rinsed the dishes. She was the last of something forgotten, or maybe something hidden. Tandeka's cruelty reached a breaking point on a moonless night when the kingdom hosted the prince of the neighboring empire. It was a banquet of spectacle and splendor, where dancers spun with fire and wines were poured from golden serpents. That night, Tandeka planned her most wicked display. She smeared the floor beneath the high table with honey and wine and called for Zivai to crawl through it, licking it clean. "She says she likes to serve," Tandeka laughed, motioning for Zivai. "Let her serve with her tongue." Zivai did not hesitate. She moved slowly, her fingers sticky, her knees wet. The nobles howled with laughter, slamming the table in joy. The prince raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the strange display. But as Zivai neared the center of the floor, something in the air shifted. The flames and the torches flickered. A hush passed like a windless breath. The wine in the cups rippled as though disturbed by a tremor. Zivai's body moved slower, not out of shame but awareness. Something inside her stirred. A voice not hers but from the soil. From the blood. A memory awakened. She pressed her hand to the tiles to balance herself, and the stone beneath her palm grew warm. It was not visible. Not yet. But the earth knew her. And it remembered her people. Tandeka, watching from the sidelines, didn't sense the shift. She only saw Zivai pause and barked, "Keep licking, girl, or you'll have nothing to eat for a week." Zivai blinked. Her eyes, for a moment, reflected the color of the moon, even though no moon hung in the sky that night. She bent and licked the floor once more. But the wine that touched her tongue didn't sting. It dissolved into sweetness. None noticed. None suspected. They were too busy laughing. And yet, that night, one of the palace hounds that had snarled at her for years came and curled beside her near the fire as she slept. That night, the bruises on her knees faded by morning. That night, the well outside the kitchen bubbled with glowing light for a moment before settling. The cruelty had deepened. But so had the awakening. Zivai said nothing. But the moon swallower inside her was beginning to stir. The first sign of Queen Asanda's illness was her silence. She had always been a woman of firm voice and measured words. Even when she spoke softly, the court leaned forward. Her presence commanded attention, not by force but by gravity. She could settle disputes with a glance, lift a child's spirit with a smile, and quiet a room with a single word. But one morning after returning from a routine walk in the royal garden, she sat on her golden throne and said nothing. Not a single word for the rest of the day. At first, the servants whispered that she must be deep in thought. Then they speculated exhaustion. But by the next morning, when she refused food and would not answer even her handmaiden's gentle voice, worry turned to fear. Healers were summoned from across the provinces. Some spoke to her, some sang, some brought bitter herbs or roots tied with red string. Nothing worked. The queen stared past them all, her eyes dim but alert, like a candle trapped in glass. Her lips moved but no sound came. She did not drink. She did not eat. Her hands, once strong and steady, began to tremble. The palace held its breath. Within days, rumors surged through the halls like wildfire. Some claimed it was a sorcerer's curse, vengeance from a jilted spirit. Others believed the queen had offended the ancestors by walking the sacred garden alone. The royal astrologers examined the stars and declared a warning had been ignored, a shift in the skies, a shadow near the moon. But none dared say it aloud. The queen was dying. And no one knew why. As the royal court tensed and the nobles argued behind closed doors about succession and protection, the kitchen became a battlefield of its own. Every whisper from the queen's chamber echoed into the kitchen corridors. And when word came that the queen had refused food for 3 days, the panic reached boiling point. Madame Tendeka's eyes gleamed with opportunity. She saw what others missed, a moment to rise. The queen needs food, she told the kitchen staff. She won't speak, but her body will remember taste. We must reach her through her tongue. She barked orders louder than ever. No more simple meals. The usual stews and grains were replaced with rich goat broths, grilled fish caught from sacred rivers, porridge soaked in imported milk and honey. Tendeka brought out her finest spices, some stored for years, saffron that glowed, dried pepper seeds said to wake the dead, roots that smelled of dreamwood and smoke. Her daughters hovered near her, acting as her trusted lieutenants. Mfatso began mixing rare oils into the food, claiming the scent alone would stir hunger. Leletti painted garnishes onto the edge of the queen's plate like it was canvas. All eyes were on them. All pressure fell on the kitchen. This was more than food now. It was power. If Tendeka could prepare the one dish that restored the queen's health, even partially, her place in the court would be unshakable. She would be rewarded, remembered, perhaps even raised above her station. She dreamed of silk robes, of being named royal culinary matron, of nobles bowing when she passed. She worked tirelessly, turning the kitchens into a furnace of ambition. Zivai, meanwhile, was relegated to the lowest tasks again. She was no longer even allowed to touch the cooking pots. Instead, Tendeka made her scrub the floors twice a day and polish the silver bowls until her fingers bled. But even so, Zivai watched. She saw the patterns in the meals, the combinations Tendeka tried. She noticed how the spices conflicted instead of blended. How the energy of the kitchen grew frantic, desperate, unnatural. Zivai, despite her silence, knew. The queen would not eat this food. Because her sickness was not of the body, it was of the spirit. In the deepest hours of the night, when the fires dimmed and the kitchens grew still, Zivai would sit near the old fireplace, breathing the ashes, remembering her mother's stories. She had heard tales of illnesses like this, soul silence they called it. A sickness not cured by roots or broths, but by memory, by connection, by the right voice. Not a loud voice. A familiar one. The palace, however, did not know what to believe. Some guards lit candles for protection. Others sharpened their spears, expecting rebellion. The queen's council grew tense. Ministers accused one another of poisoning her in secret. Even the royal dogs, sensing unease, stopped barking and began to howl at the moon each night. Still the queen did not speak. Still she refused to eat. Still her light dimmed. And still Tendeka cooked. Each morning, her daughters carried trays to the queen's chambers, only to return moments later with the untouched plates. They would lie saying, she smiled, or her hand moved, just to keep hope alive. But it was fading. Every day it slipped further. And Zivai, watching it all from the shadows, began to feel a quiet pull inside her, as if something was waiting to be awakened. Not in the kitchens. Not in Tendeka's fires. But in her. Something her mother had left behind. Something that could speak even when the tongue could not. That night, the kitchen fell into a hush so deep it felt like the palace itself was holding its breath. The fires had been dimmed, the feasts were over, and Tendeka had gone to bed early, worn from another day of disappointment. Not even the mice dared squeak in the corners. Only Zivai remained awake, crouched near the dying warmth of the fireplace where she always slept. Her hands were sore, her knees raw, and her belly hollow. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Tandeka had become so consumed with impressing the queen that even the crumbs were carefully counted. But Zivai had learned long ago how to make do with less. She waited until the deep night silence gave her safety, then crept to the edge of the kitchen where the scraps were discarded. She gathered what she could: a spoonful of roasted yam skin, half a slice of plantain, a tiny lump of rice hardened at the edge of a pot. She wrapped it all in a piece of banana leaf and slipped outside, keeping low, invisible, the way she had perfected. There was a place near the forgotten well, an old stone ring cracked with vines, half swallowed by time and weeds. No one used it anymore. They said the water had gone bitter. But Zivai didn't come for water. She came for the herbs. She had found them by accident weeks ago, pale green leaves with silver veins, growing in a quiet patch beneath a sleeping fig tree. They had a smell unlike anything else in the kitchen, not sharp like pepper or warm like thyme, but soft, almost sad. When she crushed a few between her fingers, it reminded her of rainy nights and lullabies. Her mother had once sung to her about such herbs. Moon-touched greens, she called them. Plants that drank starlight instead of sun. Zivai had never known if those stories were real, or just fragments of bedtime dreams. But tonight, her heart told her they were more than stories. She plucked a few leaves gently, like asking permission, then returned to the shadows behind the kitchen wall where the old clay stove sat unused. She kindled a tiny flame with dry twigs and set a broken metal pot over it, adding a bit of water, the herbs, and her scraps. As it warmed, she hummed softly. It wasn't a song anyone else would know. Just a tune her mother used to hum while stirring broth, one that rose and fell like wind through reeds. She didn't hum to entertain. She hummed to remember. And somehow, as the tune slipped from her lips and into the steam, the air around the pot shifted. The water shimmered. The scraps softened and took on a strange glow, faint, barely visible, like moonlight dancing in a puddle. Zivai didn't notice at first. She was too hungry, too tired. When it was ready, she removed the pot from the fire, let it cool, and began to eat slowly. Each bite tasted like memory, not of food but of warmth, of belonging, of being held. She didn't know that someone had been watching. A kitchen boy named Kuda had been returning from the outer courtyard after feeding the hounds. He was new to the palace, often ignored like her, but curious. He moved quietly and paused when he saw the flicker of light near the stove. He crouched behind a pillar and watched Zivai's ritual in silence. And when she finally left, he crept forward, drawn by the scent. The pot still held a bit of broth. He dipped a finger in, tasted it, and blinked. The air around him pulsed. For a moment, he saw colors in the darkness, swirls of blue and silver that seemed to hum through his chest. Then, dizzy and warm, he stumbled back to his sleeping mat and collapsed. The next morning, the boy didn't show up for his chores. A guard found him still asleep, eyes fluttering behind closed lids. When they finally woke him, he smiled strangely and whispered, "I flew." Everyone laughed, assuming he had dreamed something foolish. But he kept repeating it. "I flew. Above the clouds. I saw stars up close." And the queen was there, reaching for a bowl of light. No one listened, until the old stableman who had noticed the boy's fever the day before, touched his forehead. "The heat is gone," he said, surprised. "He's healed." Whispers spread. Quietly. Carefully. But Zivai said nothing. She returned to the well that night. Picked more herbs. Sat again by the clay stove and hummed. There was more food to make. And something inside her was waking. Something deeper than hunger. The palace had always been a place of noise, chatter, clanging, shouting, singing, drumming, but this was something different. The sound that began moving through the corridors wasn't loud. It didn't come with trumpets or footsteps. It traveled quietly, like a draft slipping through a sealed door. A whisper. A rumor. A name. Zivai. The boy's strange story had been brushed off by most as fever dream nonsense. But the ones who had seen his sickness, those who had watched him barely able to stand, could not ignore the fact that he now walked with energy and spoke with clarity. And the strange word he kept repeating, "She fed me starlight," clung to people's minds like sap. A few brave ones began to ask questions. And then a guard came forward, not openly but with hesitation and secrecy. He was one of the lower-ranked men, one whose job kept him by the outer walls. His leg bore a deep gash from a training accident with a spear, and the wound had not healed in weeks. The palace healer had prescribed ash poultices and bitter roots, but the infection had grown worse. He limped, he groaned in pain at night, and he knew it would only be a matter of time before he was dismissed for being unfit. He had heard the whispers. Of a girl in the kitchens. of a meal that glowed, of healing. So under the cover of dusk, he approached the fire alcove near the broken clay stove, pretending to adjust the wood supply. Zivai sat nearby, peeling root skins with her fingers, not startled by his presence. She had begun to expect them, the desperate, the aching, the ones with nothing left to lose. "I heard," he said softly, keeping his face turned away from the torchlight. "I need something. Anything." Zivai didn't ask questions. She only nodded. She took a bowl she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard, one she never let anyone touch, and added water from a gourd, a sliver of pumpkin skin and a few bruised herbs from her pouch. She hummed quietly as it cooked, a tune low enough not to attract attention but steady enough to shape the broth. It took only minutes. When she handed it to him, the man hesitated. "It's just soup?" Zivai looked at him, her eyes calm and unreadable. "No," she said. "It's not just anything." He drank. That night the pain in his leg dulled, then vanished. By morning the swelling had gone down and the scab sealed shut. When he unwrapped his cloth bandage, he saw pink skin where rot had been. And he understood. He never told anyone directly. But his limp was gone. His laughter returned. He stood taller, straighter. Others noticed. They didn't ask out loud, but the ripple had begun. The whispers spread like fire through dry grass. "She makes food that heals. She knows forgotten herbs. She sings the sickness out of your bones. She carries her mother's magic. She cooks under moonlight." The nobles didn't know. Not yet. But the servants did. The guards. The boys and girls who fetched water, cleaned rooms, mucked the stables. They came to Zivai in pairs, then in groups of 3. A girl with a rotting tooth. A cook's apprentice with a bleeding cough. A maid with sleeplessness and shaking hands. Zivai never refused them. She gave them all small bowls, small herbs, small songs. And all of them in their own ways healed. But she told them, "Tell no one." And for a while they obeyed. Until Tandeka noticed. The kitchen mistress wasn't an idiot. She saw how Zivai no longer limped despite endless hours of scrubbing. How the girl's skin no longer looked sunken. She saw the guard who had limped now jogging upstairs. She saw the kitchen boy's glowing cheeks. At first she assumed someone had smuggled medicine into the palace. But then she noticed the stove, the broken one that had long been cold, bore signs of ash again. Faint traces. And once, when passing Zivai's corner, she swore she smelled roasted figs and green smoke. She said nothing. Not until she caught Zivai handing a maid a covered bowl near the well. That was enough. Tandeka's rage was cold, sharp, and swift. That same night, she dragged Zivai by the wrist in front of the kitchen staff and shouted, "You think you can play healer? You think you can sneak behind my back, touch food without permission?" Zivai didn't speak. "From now on," Tandeka hissed, "you don't go near the pots. You don't touch a grain of rice. You don't lay a finger on a spoon." She turned to the others. "Anyone caught receiving anything from her will be whipped and thrown into the mud." Zivai was sentenced again to only the filth, to licking plates, scrubbing pots with her bare fingers, and eating nothing unless it was trash. Tandeka ordered her corner be searched. Her pouch of herbs was burned. Her bowl smashed. But what Tandeka didn't understand was that Zivai's gift was not in the bowl. It was in her. The fire had been lit. And not even the kitchen mistress could stop the heat that now whispered through the palace. The queen's sickness had not lifted. Days passed. Then weeks. Her eyes dulled further. Her lips remained sealed. Every dish placed before her went untouched. The healers began to avoid her chambers altogether, unwilling to face their own failure. Even the palace dogs no longer waited near her door, as if they knew death was drawing closer. But in the silence, the queen listened. She could not speak, could not move much, but her ears still worked. And the palace, as always, whispered. Her handmaidens tried to hide it, but Queen Asanda saw the sideways glances, the rushed silences when she entered a room. And then one morning, as she sat in her sun-drenched chamber watching the wind stir the garden leaves, she heard a slip of a voice. A maid, barely old enough to carry a tray, whispering to another servant behind the curtain. "They say she healed a fever with only broth." "Who?" "The ash girl. The one who licks the plates." The queen's eyes twitched. She lifted a hand, weak, trembling, and pointed to the curtain. The guard summoned her steward immediately. She could not speak, but her message was clear. Her fingers pressed firmly into the cushion as she wrote with shaking hands on a silk cloth. "Bring the girl who cooks healing food. The one the servants whisper about. Bring her." The steward bowed. "Yes, your majesty." Word raced through the palace like lightning. Down in the kitchens, Tendeka's world cracked open. She had worked all her life for power in the royal kitchens, mastering every spice, every technique. She had dreamed of serving the queen in person. But never had she been summoned like this, not for food, not for service, but for a girl she had tried so hard to crush. Panic bloomed in her chest. She couldn't let Zivai go. Couldn't risk her gifts being seen, honored, elevated. Everything she had built would collapse if the queen knew she had tried to extinguish a miracle. So Tendeka did what desperate people always do. She lied. She chose Leleti, her youngest daughter, the prettier, quieter one, and dressed her in royal silks borrowed from a sympathetic laundry maid. She combed her hair, rubbed herbs into her skin, and hung a spice pouch at her hip. Then she gave her a carefully prepared script. If the queen asks, you say you've always sung while cooking. You say your mother taught you secret recipes. You say healing comes from the heart. Leleti, nervous but flattered, nodded. Meanwhile, Zivai watched from the shadows behind the spice rack. She had known this day would come, the moment when her name reached someone who mattered. She had not expected it to come so soon. She had not expected the fear in Tendeka's eyes. But she remained silent. She always had. As Leleti was led away, Zivai pressed a hand to her chest. Beneath the bones, beneath the ache of exhaustion, something glowed, a steady heat, a hum she now recognized as her inheritance. Her birthright. She returned to her corner near the broken stove, sat by the faint ashes and waited. In the queen's chamber, the curtains were drawn wide. Light pooled on her golden bed, but her face remained pale, nearly translucent. Her fingers trembled as she looked up and saw the girl before her. Leleti bowed deeply, her voice shaking. I am the one they speak of, my queen. The queen studied her. And frowned. The girl was too clean. Her hands too soft. Her voice too rehearsed. There was no song in her bones. Still the queen allowed her to try. Leleti prepared a bowl of broth, using Tendeka's special blend, saffron, honey root, a dash of cinnamon. She hummed awkwardly as she stirred. When she presented the bowl to the queen, the old woman lifted it slowly, touched it to her lips, and tasted. Then she set it down. Her eyes closed. And nothing changed. Her hand did not move. Her voice did not return. The room filled with a silence so heavy it made even the guards uneasy. The steward turned to Leleti, confused. Are you sure you're the one they spoke of? Leleti stammered. Why yes. I've cooked for the servants before. But the queen raised a hand. With trembling fingers she wrote one word on her silk cloth. Was. Astros. Back in the kitchen, Tendeka paced like a trapped animal. Her plans were unraveling, thread by thread. She muttered to herself, unsure of what had gone wrong. The queen should have accepted the illusion. She should have thanked her. Rewarded her. But she hadn't. And now the lie would begin to rot. Zivai remained silent, pretending to scrub a bowl. But inside her, something ancient stirred. The shadows around her seemed to whisper. The herbs near the well had grown taller. The moon that night hung lower than before, as if watching. The queen had called for the girl who healed. And that girl had not yet come. But the palace would soon learn. Truth does not remain hidden forever. The room froze. The queen, pale as ash and quiet for weeks, had lifted the spoon with trembling fingers. The broth inside shimmered slightly, too much oil, too much artifice. Leleti, standing beside the bed, wrung her hands, hiding her trembling under a veil of false confidence. Behind her, the steward held his breath. The handmaiden stood with wide eyes. No one expected anything. No one dared hope. Until the queen's lips parted. And her tongue rejected the first sip. She spit the liquid out violently, a sharp, startling sound in the silent chamber, and the golden bowl slipped from her fingers, clanging against the floor, spilling its contents like spoiled truth. Then for the first time in nearly a month, her voice, hoarse, dry but unmistakably alive, rang through the air. This is not the one. The chamber gasped. One of the guards stumbled backward. A handmaiden let out a soft sob. The steward fell to his knees in shock. And Leleti, poor, trembling Leleti, began to cry, tears streaking her powdered cheeks as she shook her head. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, Mama said. The queen, still weak, fixed her with a gaze so sharp it cut deeper than any sword. Her voice cracked as she turned to the steward. Find the real girl. Now. Astros. Down in the kitchens, the atmosphere changed like a snapped string. The scream of a servant echoed from upstairs, followed by heavy boots pounding down the marble staircases. The queen's words were being repeated like wildfire on dry grass. Asterisk, this is not the one. Asterisk asterisk, she spoke again. Asterisk asterisk, she spat it out. Asterisk. Zivai had been crouched by the ashes, scrubbing a burnt pot when she heard it. She didn't move. She only listened. Her breath came slower now, more like someone preparing for rain than running from fire. She knew this was the moment everything would turn. But Tandeka panicked. She ran from the spice shelf to the basin, shouting orders to her daughters. Hide the herbs. Smash every bowl she's touched. We tell them nothing. We say it was all lies, dreams, fairy tales. The queen's fever has made her delusional. Laletti stumbled into the room, sobbing, mascara smeared, her royal disguise in tatters. She knew, Mama, she knew. She said I wasn't the one. Tandeka slapped her across the face. The entire kitchen went silent. But before she could utter another order, the guards arrived. 4 of them. Spears drawn. Faces hard. They did not knock. They did not ask questions. They surrounded Tandeka, and the steward stepped forward, voice calm but final. The queen demands the girl. The real one. And you are to remain here until she is found. Tandeka, eyes wild, backed away toward the oven. I don't know what you're talking about. That girl's a servant. A beggar. She licks plates, she can't even boil water. But one of the guards grabbed her arm. Another pulled her away from the spice shelf. And in that moment, every servant in the kitchen turned. All eyes drifted to one girl, crouched quietly near the fireplace, hands stained with ash and soap, eyes watching with ancient calm. Zivai did not rise immediately. She met Tandeka's gaze, and saw not just fear but disbelief. Because Tandeka had built her world around the belief that someone like Zivai could never matter. Could never rise. Could never be more than the dirt she crawled on. But here she was. And the queen had called for her. Slowly Zivai stood. Her bones ached. Her feet were bare. But something deeper had taken root in her spine, something steadier than fear. Something stronger than shame. One of the guards approached her. His tone, unlike with Tandeka, was gentle. Is it you? Zivai nodded once. He bowed. The entire kitchen watched, stunned, as she was led out. Not by force, not like a prisoner, but like a guest finally being welcomed. Asterisk. Back in the chamber, the queen sat upright now, sweat glistening on her forehead. Her voice was hoarse, but her breath came stronger with every minute. The bowl still lay shattered on the marble floor. And she waited. Not for food, but for truth. And the moment the girl in ash stepped through the doorway, barefoot and humble, the queen closed her eyes. And whispered, yes, this is the one. Zivai stood in the doorway of the queen's chamber, her bare feet pressing softly into the velvet rug. The warmth of the room, heavy with incense and royal perfume, clung to her skin like a question. She still wore her torn gray rags. Ash smudged her cheeks. Her hands, cracked and calloused, gripped the edge of her apron out of habit, as if she expected to be scolded, dragged away, or forced to explain her presence. But the queen was looking at her. Really looking. Her face, once so pale and hollow, now carried a soft flush. Her eyes, long shrouded by silence, glimmered with something old and powerful. Recognition. She extended a trembling hand, palm up. You may cook, she said, her voice fragile but firm. Freely. However you choose. The court gasped again. No one had been given such permission. Not even the highest chefs. But the queen said no more. She simply waited. Zivai turned slowly, guided by a guard, toward a low brass stove that had been wheeled into the chamber earlier. She didn't need Tandeka's spices. She didn't need silver tools or imported fruits. She only needed time, and a little quiet. And so she began. First, she reached into the pouch at her hip, a fresh one hastily sewn for her by the steward who believed in omens, and took out the dried herbs she'd rescued from the well's edge. Their leaves shimmered faintly in the light, veins pulsing like memory. She crushed them gently between her fingers, releasing a scent both earthy and bright, like rain on stone. Next, she boiled water in a simple clay pot. The palace had gold and silver, but Zivai always trusted clay. It was honest. Like her mother's hands. She added the rice, a plain grain from the kitchen's supply, nothing rich or rare. As it softened, she spooned in a drop of wild honey she had hidden from the night before. Sweet, dark, alive. The kind of honey that caught stories in its sugar. And then she hummed. Softly at first. A tune her mother used to hum while cooking by firelight. The melody curled through the steam into the corners of the chamber, around the stunned guards and wide-eyed servants. The queen leaned forward, her lips parting slightly, as if the song pulled at something inside her. Her heartbeat slowed. Her breath deepened. Zivai stirred once, twice, 3 times. She did not taste the food. She didn't need to. The heat, the herbs, the hum, they spoke to each other in ways that no recipe ever could. When it was ready, she poured it into a plain wooden bowl and carried it to the queen herself. No silver platter. No embroidered cloth. Just the girl in ash, offering a simple dish with her head bowed in reverence. The queen took it with both hands. She held it near her face and inhaled, and her eyes fluttered closed as tears filled them. She hadn't cried in months. The illness had stolen everything from her, appetite, speech, joy. But now, her fingers trembled not from weakness but from awe. She took a spoonful and tasted. A hush fell over the room. A long pause. And then, her shoulders eased. Her mouth opened slightly. Her eyes cleared. And from deep within her chest, like sunlight cracking through clouds, a long breath escaped. Warmth flooded her cheeks. The spoon fell back into the bowl, and the queen leaned back into her pillows with a stunned, glowing look. She stared at Zivai, not in confusion or curiosity but with quiet reverence. Then she spoke. "This is healing." One of the guards stepped forward. "Your Majesty, are you?" The queen lifted a hand not to silence him, but to steady herself as she smiled. It was small at first, then fuller. Her lips curved gently. Her eyes shimmered. The Queen of Mbale had not smiled in nearly 3 moons. Now she looked like a woman reborn. "I can feel my fingers," she said, flexing them with wonder. "My throat doesn't burn." She reached for Zivai's hand, rough, scarred, trembling, and placed it over her own heart. "You did this," she whispered. "Not with gold or titles. With truth." Behind them, the steward bowed until his forehead touched the ground. The guards dropped their spears in respect. Even the palace dogs barked, once then again as if cheering the moment. But Zivai only nodded, quiet as always. Because she knew. The song wasn't just hers. It was her mother's. It was the earth's. And now it belonged to the queen too. The queen, still radiant with renewed strength, turned toward the gathered court, her voice sharp and clear. "Who among you knew?" she asked. The silence was thick. Then, one by one, the voices came. A steward admitted to hearing rumors but staying quiet out of fear. A young guard confessed that he had once seen Zivai scrub the floor with bruised knees, licking plates as nobles laughed. A servant girl wept as she described watching Zivai be slapped for humming. A noblewoman, flushed with shame, admitted she had eaten food Zivai had prepared and mocked her afterward. More and more voices joined. Each testimony peeled back another layer of rot hiding behind the palace's polished doors. Truth flooded the hall not with fury, but with cleansing power. Each word washed the air cleaner. At the center of it all, Tendeka tried to shrink into the floor. The queen's eyes found her like a sword's edge. "Kitchen Mistress Tendeka," she said, her voice heavy, "you used my illness as an opportunity to lie, to cheat, and to crush someone who was born with a sacred gift." Tendeka dropped to her knees. "Your Majesty, I—" But the queen silenced her with a raised hand. "You are stripped of your title," she declared. "Your daughters will be exiled to the western hills. The royal kitchens will never again carry your name." Gasps filled the chamber, but no one protested. The guards moved quickly, taking Tendeka and her daughters by the arms. Laleti began to cry again, whispering apologies, but Zivai did not look at her. Not with hatred. Not even with pity. She simply turned to the queen, lowered her eyes, and bowed. "I do not ask for vengeance," she said quietly. "I only ever wanted to feed people." The queen stood. Her gaze softened. "And so you shall," she said. "But not as a servant. Not as a shadow." She reached for a gold scarf from the nearby offering table and draped it over Zivai's shoulders. "From this day on, you are the royal healer of the kitchen. All food shall pass through your hands and your song. You will teach others, not just how to cook but how to listen." Zivai blinked. She hadn't asked for a crown. She hadn't asked for glory. But this was right. The court bowed. Even the nobles who once ignored her now knelt. And for the first time in the kingdom's long history, the sound of a cook's hum was heard in the royal hall, soft, warm, and unstoppable. The garden by the forgotten well had once been nothing but weeds and stones, a place where broken tools were tossed and kitchen waste was buried. No one remembered the last time anything living had been planted there. But Zivai remembered the way it felt. It had been the only place where her mother's songs rose clearly in her mind. It had been the place where healing herbs once whispered to her, where the air hummed with possibility. And now, standing in the light of her new role, she returned, not as a servant sneaking moments of silence, but as the royal healer of the kitchen. With her own hands she cleared the weeds. With her own voice she sang over the soil. And slowly the garden responded. Bright green sprigs pushed through old earth. Forgotten roots, stirred by her humming, grew strong again. Vines crept along the walls, not to choke, but to bloom. The rare herbs of her mother's people, the moonleaf, the dust root, the star petal, began to grow. The air itself smelled different, like stories made into steam. She called it the Garden of Forgotten Flavors. And it became the kingdom's quiet treasure. Children came first, some curious, others wounded by more than scraped knees. Zivai taught them how to crush leaves between their palms and smell the secrets. She taught them how to stir with care, to listen to how soup speaks, to understand the difference between a meal that fills the belly and one that fills the spirit. Servants came too, some shy, still unsure how to look her in the eyes. But Zivai held no grudge. She taught them with kindness, offering warmth instead of shame. The broken-hearted, the hungry, the tired, all found peace in her garden. And the nobles? They came last, quietly, humbly. Not for power, but for comfort. She served them with the same simplicity she always had. A bowl of rice. A tea steeped with memory. A stew that made old warriors weep with the taste of childhood. They began to say her name in reverence. Not as a servant. Not as a girl in ash. But as a woman of flame and earth, who turned pain into flavor and silence into song. In time, stories would say that Zivai could cook a memory back to life, or stir sorrow out of a soul. But those who knew her best said this. She listens before she cooks. And so, the girl who once licked plates in secret now watched her garden bloom, not just with plants but with people. And with every meal she shared, the legend of Zivai grew. Every year, when the rains began to fall soft and steady over the Mbale kingdom, the palace prepared for the Feast of Remembrance, not with trumpets or parades but with warmth, silence, and song. It was held on the same date, without fail, the anniversary of the day Queen Asanda's voice returned. The day healing came not from a potion or a priest, but from a simple wooden bowl, and the hands of a girl who had once been forgotten. Zivai. Now known across the land not only as the royal healer of the kitchen, but as the keeper of taste, memory, and mercy. The feast was her creation. Under her guidance, no royal chef touched a dish. No golden spoon was set out. Instead, long tables stretched across the palace courtyard, without separation between noble and servant, elder and child. They sat side by side, sleeves rolled, shoes off, faces bare. And each person was handed a simple clay plate. Zivai stood at the head of the table, wrapped not in jewels but in a shawl of woven garden leaves and dyed threads from her first kitchen apron. Her hands were dusted with flour and sun, her hair braided with moon petals from her garden. She spoke before the food was served, not a speech but a soft reminder. Eat with gratitude, she said. Clean your own plate. Remember those who once fed you when no one else would. The food was simple yet rich with story, steaming rice with memory herbs, soft bread shaped by small hands, broth made from roots grown under moonlight. Every bite carried a piece of someone's pain healed. Laughter echoed. Tears too. Children passed bowls to elders. Nobles served servants with steady hands. There was no rank at the table, only hunger and the joy of being fed with care. When the last spoonful was eaten, a hush would fall. And the queen, now older but strong as ever, would rise from her seat at the far end. She would lift her plate, smile at Zivai and slowly, deliberately lick it clean. Not as a joke. Not as a ceremony. But as a vow. As a way to say, I remember. The crowd would watch in silence. Some would cry. Others would smile. But all would understand. Because the queen was not honoring just a dish or a girl or even a moment in time. She was honoring the truth. That once, a girl was forced to lick plates in silence. And now, the kingdom licked theirs, with pride, with reverence, and with hearts full of the flavor only kindness can bring. And so, year after year, the Feast of Remembrance bloomed, not from ritual but from love. From Zivai, the girl who fed a queen, and healed a kingdom.